Firstly, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our dear friend, Dr. Anne Buddle, who's joining us from Glasgow, Scotland. And it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Anne. I wish we could have all been together at the CSMVS Museum, but we'll have to leave that for another day. You visited us in Bombay and have always given us interesting lectures on a variety of topics. And today I'm delighted on behalf of the chairperson and the trustees of the CSMVS, on behalf of the Museum Society, my executive committee, and on my own behalf and on behalf of our guests who are attending today, a very, very warm welcome to you. We are absolutely delighted that we could do a lecture with you even under these stressful times. Ladies and gentlemen, do indulge me. A few words about Annie before we plunge into Under a Distant Sky, Thoughts of Home, that is Scotland from India. Dr. Buddle joined the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh in 1993. After 22 years in London, working briefly at the British Museum and in 4 different departments and in different capacities at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. As registrar and head of collections management at NGS, her department managed international loans and exhibitions and coordinated object handling, logistics, and the collection database for all special projects, including the establishment of Duff House, Aberdeenshire, as a partnership gallery, and the decant and redisplay of the entire Scottish National Portrait Gallery. Redisplay, I could follow Annie, but I had to ask you, what is decant? Are we talking about wine or something like that? And then, of course, you said, when the collections are moved out and housed for a temporary period of time in another location, that's an interesting way to describe that, to decant a collection. She introduced and managed the first NGS disposals and rehoming program and established and led the NGS Due Diligence Provenance Research Project. She was a member of the UK Spoliation Working Group from 2000 to 2020. And I asked her what that actually meant. And she said it was all the treasures that were taken from one country to another during times of war, unrest, and tragedies that affected the world over the last century. Anne has lectured internationally and has published in museum issues, special research topics and aspects of the Scots in India, including one of her favorite characters from history, Tipu Sultan as patron of the arts, the drawings of Eliza Hunter Blair, she's lectured on her and her family in India, and the Bannerman illustrated letters of the Bannerman children as they were writing letters backwards and forwards between them and their family. For the 1999 Edinburgh Festival, she curated the NGS exhibition and the website, The Tiger and the Thistle, Tipu Sultan and the Scots in India, 1760 to 1800. And that was the time, a little before that, when she was at the V&A, I was introduced to Anne by my dear friend, many of you remember her, Pauline Rohatki, said, we're going to meet a person who's absolutely besotted by a character from your country. And I quizzed her and said, who is that, you know? And she said, Tipu Sultan. She's besotted with him, just as much as you and I are besotted with other people who lived 250 years ago. She is the authority on Tipu, and you're really going to enjoy meeting her this afternoon. And I'm so happy that we, Anne and I, and Anne and the CSMVS have kept up such a warm and cordial relationship. And she's never, ever failed to rise up to all the demands we make to her. And over the years has got to know Dr. Kalpana Desai and now Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee on a personal capacity, and has introduced us to several scholars from Glasgow and Edinburgh. So thank you very, very much for that, Annie. We really, really appreciate that. She also did an exhibition, Indian Interlude, in 2007, the 60th anniversary of Indian independence. She co-organized the Friends of the NGS's visit to India in 2008 and hosted a visit for the Patna design team in 2015 and devised the funding and funded the NGS Make in Mumbai project 2016-2020. And this was to develop and facilitate the exchange of staff between NGS and India. In 2019, Anne published the first survey of India-related material in the NGS collections, a contribution to the book India in Edinburgh, 1750s to the present time. And this was edited by Professor Roger Jeffrey, University of Edinburgh. Anne had a virtual retirement. I was privileged to be included in that last year in June 2020. And this time, we're not going to let you get away when you arrive in India. We're going to give you a rousing welcome and none of this virtual stuff, Anne. Anne is an external expert advisor on the UK government's reviewing committee for the export of works of art and has recently been invited to become a trustee of the Kolkata Scottish Heritage Trust. Unfortunately, we tried to find a Bombay Scottish Heritage Trust connection, but we don't have one as yet. But the Kolkata group actually is there primarily, like all these other groups, like BAXA, is to look after the war graves and cemeteries of those who have gone on ahead of us, representing their different nations. We've promised her that when she comes to Bombay next, we will take her to George Wittet's grave in the Savory Cemetery. And that makes me move on to our topic. The Scottish associations with India have a long and familiar history, from early traders to soldiers and surveyors, from missionaries to viceroys, from historians to doctors, engineers, lawyers, and teachers. The architect of CSMVS itself, George Wittet, was a Scot. When these men and women are mentioned in conversation or in writing, they may be identified as Scots or from Scotland. Occasionally, the name of a specific town or place is also included, perhaps the birthplace or resettling or retirement. For a Scot in India, however, these names would have had a far more personal resonance, and they would certainly have referred to it as home. Today, in our progressive but pandemic-gripped 21st century, India-Scotland travel is still virtually impossible for most of us. This talk has been devised to bring Scotland's distant sky to your screens, from Sutherland to the borders, and from the islands to the cities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Dundee. Many of the Scots mentioned will be familiar to us in India. For them, the buildings, towns, and landscapes you will see on screen must often have been in their thoughts of home from India and under such a very, very distant sky. Thank you, Annie. We are really privileged to have you here today. And before I hand you over to our tech team, I have to thank them. What would we have done without Jason John, who leads the team week after week, and Sanjana, Aishwarya, Mrinalini, Rochelle, and Yashraj. Thank you very, very much. And now over to the tech team.
Rosa, thank you so much for that very, very warm and generous welcome. It reminded me that I was last in Bombay last February, and that seems such a long time ago now. So it's very good to be back, albeit in a virtual meeting. I'm a virtual dinosaur, I don't mind admitting that, and this is my first Zoom meeting. So I would like to thank CSMVS, Dr. Mukherjee, Dr. Feroza Godrej for inviting me to speak on this occasion and for thus launching me into the digital age. My thanks also to Dr. Jason John and the technicians. As Feroza said, without them, this would absolutely not be possible. In Edinburgh, we should be in the middle of the Edinburgh International Festival now, but because of the pandemic, there's no tattoo, There's no festival theatre, and although everyone has made a great effort to organise performances outside or to adapt them for Zoom, it's a pretty reduced Edinburgh Festival this year. We very much hope that by next year, life will have returned to some sort of normal, and I shall be booking my ticket to Bombay for 2022. Meanwhile, we are, as Feroza said, very far apart. We are still under a distant sky. You're a distant sky from mine, and I am the same for you. And that leads to the title of tonight's talk. I'm just going to share my screen with you, having learnt the technology tonight. Right. Fine. So tonight we're going to think about being under a distant sky, thoughts of Scotland from India. As you've already heard, for 18 months, a worldwide pandemic has locked us all into our homes, and travel has been impossible. For me, thinking of India from Scotland recalls images of people, buildings and landscapes, all under the Indian sun. And you will recognise that phrase from the title of Feroza Godrej and Pauline Rohatke's book on British landscape artists in India. And I thank them for the inspiration for my theme today, Thoughts of Home from Scots in India. Everyone is familiar with the Scots in India, from viceroys to botanists and soldiers to archaeologists, but we rarely focus on their homes, the buildings and landscapes which these Scots must so often have thought of and dreamed of when they were in India. I hope that tonight's images will bridge that gap between people and places, past and present, by offering you in Bombay a virtual tour of Scotland and introducing buildings and landscapes under a distant sky, the places which Scots in India would have thought of when anyone mentioned the word home. Sorry, we are just need to get the next slide. Wonderful, thank you. Houghton House is probably the grandest home in Scotland, designed by Robert Adam for the Hope family, whose descendants, the Earls of Linlithgow, included the second Marquis, Viceroy of India from 1936 to 1943. Most Scots, of course, did not live in palaces. The failure of the Jacobite Rising in 1746 saw many Scots seeking a living by enlisting in the British Army and serving abroad. By the last quarter of the 18th century, many Highland landowners realised that there was more money in sheep farming than in contributing to the centuries-old practice of tenant farming and crofting. The Highland clearances made way for sheep rearing and saw whole communities forcibly evicted from their land and homes by the very clan chiefs whom they had served for generations. Those from Borereg, which you see here in ruins on the Isle of Skye, were resettled in Australia. Others set off for Canada or Ireland or tried to secure patronage for India. Families who made their names in India, Elgin, Dalhousie, Dalrymple and Dow, will be familiar to you. Two viceroys, one legal family, and Alexander Dow, author of the first History of Hindustan in English and the first to suggest what became the permanent settlement in India. To add a topical note, Dow's statue by Chantry was one of very few British statues left standing in public places after 1947. The other homes from top left are Broom Hall for the Elgins. The 8th Earl of Elgin was Viceroy for only 18 months in 1862, but Victor, the 9th Earl, was Viceroy from 1894 to 1899. Next, on the right, top right, Brechin Castle for Lord Dalhousie, Governor-General 1848 to 1856, who expanded the railways, introduced the electric telegraph and the uniform postal system, and established Simla as home to the British government in the summer. New Hales for the Dalrymples, judges and lawyers, ancestor of the author William Dalrymple, and Guns Green at Eyemouth, southeast of Edinburgh, where Dow worked briefly with his uncle, who operated a highly successful business of smuggling tea into Scotland. The family of William Roxburgh, the botanist, came originally from Craigie in Ayrshire. James Ferguson, the architectural historian, was also an Ayrshire man. Newby, about 40 miles east of Edinburgh, was built in 1817 for General Sir David Baird of Tipu and Seringapatam fame, when he retired from military life, an eye-catching Gothic mansion which replaced a classical building designed by William Adam only a few decades earlier. Scots in India not only thought of buildings as home, they also recalled the setting and the home landscape, such as here at Navarre, home of the Munro family. Sir Hector Munro fought in the Mysore Wars. His son died after being mauled by a tiger while picnicking in the Sundarbans in 1792. This macabre event may have inspired Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, to commission the musical automaton Tipu's Tiger, now in the V&A. We know that the Scots recognised similarities between some of the landscapes they encountered in India and their own Scottish landscapes back home. Major Dirham, whose family were from Muir-Esk in Aberdeenshire, published one of the standard accounts of the Third Mysore War in 1790. He wrote from near Rator in 1791, "This country is a most delightful one, beautifully situated. I think myself in the Highlands every morning." Two images illustrate his point: a watercolour by Colonel Johnson of the Bombay Engineers and a view of Glen Orchy in Argyllshire today. The watercolour is inscribed "Waterfall in Sunda of the Purvar River, about 4 miles southwest of Hullyhull. Colonel Johnson was in Hullyhull in 1801. This picture is said to represent himself." Scotland is a small country with a total population of only 5.4 million. The greatest north-south distance from the north tip of Shetland to the southwest border is approximately 800 kilometres, with a maximum width of only 248 kilometres. But even in such a small area, as you'll see from these images, there is no single landscape which would adequately represent Scotland. In the north, Sutherland is an area of mountain and low-yield land, home to the family of Nobel Prize winner Roland Ross, who identified mosquitoes as the carriers of malaria, though Roland himself was actually born in Almora in India. Home also to David Scott, director of the East India Company, whose home was at Duninult. To the west lie many of Scotland's islands, over 900 of them in total, although only about 100 of them are inhabited, including Mull, which was home to Lachlan Macquarie of Mysore Wars and later governor in Australia. Another island is Skye, home of the Dr. Sir James Martin, one of the first to study and publish on tropical diseases as early as 1841. The largest areas of fertile land lie to the east in Aberdeenshire, Angus, home of the famous Aberdeen Angus cattle, and Perthshire, where Alexander Duff came from Moulin, the village you see here on the right. Also from this area were Robert Kidd, whose cousin purchased Kiddapore docks for the company in 1807, James Stuart Mill, author of A History of British India, published in 1818, and Dr. George Buist, editor of the Bombay Times from 1839 to 1857. And finally, the Scottish borders, rolling countryside and moorland, cattle country, scattered with castles to defend the Scots against raids from the English south of the border. This area was home to Sir John Malcolm, whose Political History of India of 1811 counselled that India should be allowed to work out its own destiny and not be constantly constrained by British attitudes. The borders are also home to Sir Walter Scott at Abbotsford, near Melrose, who set 3 of his novels against the background of the Mysore Wars, and to John Willison, born at Lauder and well known to you as president of the Bombay Literary Society and from Willison College, which still bears its name. Some of these Scottish landscapes are thousands of years old. The Neolithic stone circle of 3000 to 1500 BC at Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, an island which is home to Colin Mackenzie. The glaciated river valley of the River Tay, Scotland's longest river at 190 kilometres, which flows through Perth, which was home to George Wittet, and the volcanic rock in Edinburgh, some 350 million years old. The many Scottish links between Scotland's capital city, Edinburgh, and India were explored in chapters published in the book Feroza mentioned, India in Edinburgh, 1750s to the present, edited by Professor Roger Jeffrey of Edinburgh University. Scotland has always been tied to the sea. There is nearly 10,000 kilometres of mainland coastline and twice that figure if you include all the 900-odd island coastlines. One of the largest islands is Lewis and Harris, with its sheltered harbour at Stornoway, the capital. The soldier, draftsman, collector and surveyor general Colin Mackenzie was born here and is commemorated at the family burial ground at Agnish. Unable to afford a passage home from India after the financial crash of 1806, Mackenzie never saw his home in Scotland again and died at Calcutta in 1821 after 38 years in India. Life is still tough here, where some of the fishing villages clinging to the cliffs have only a narrow path separating their front doors from the sea and the storms. Crivy, which you see here in Aberdeenshire, would have been familiar to the artist James Wales, who came from Peterhead, 30 miles further east along the coast. Today, Peterhead processes more fish landed by UK vessels than any other British port. Here, fish are marketed and auctioned daily in their thousands, and trawlers are repaired in the dry dock. Imagine thinking of home and Peterhead from the court of Poona, where James Wales, whose home was Peterhead, painted the Peshawar Madhu Rao in 1792. Banff in Aberdeenshire was formerly the county town of a region that was home to Major Durham at Mures and the Munro family, whose estate we've already seen at Navarre. In the winter, wealthier members of society would move from their country estates to townhouses in Banff, which became rich enough to support its own silversmiths, as well as its own fishing fleet. Now only Macduff across the bay has trawlers, and even with today's sophisticated 4,000-ton freezer trawlers, facing the elements is still a challenge. Inland this winter, Braemar's nighttime temperature plummeted to minus 23 degrees centigrade, which even for Scotland is pretty chilly. Aberdeenshire roads were blocked for days, as you see here. This is the road between Banff and Aberchurder, and Aberchurder was the home to the photographer Fred Bremner. Snow, of course, blocked all the access to Crivy with its steep approach road, so Crivy was blocked off by land, and also the storms and the sea were too dangerous to risk reaching the outside world by water. If this landscape was home, and it was such a perpetual struggle to earn a livelihood from the sea or the land, one can understand why so many Scots exported their sons to India in the hope that they might shake the pagoda tree and survive long enough to return home to Scotland. The 5 Fraser brothers from Relig in Inverness-shire followed each other to India from 1801 onwards, determined to make enough money to rescue and maintain the family estate. Their story is told in a wonderful book by Cathy Fraser, For the Love of a Highland Home, published in 2019. Only one of the 5 brothers survived to return home to Relig. Before losing their sons to India, sisters might sketch their brothers and parents might commission portraits, as here, William Fraser of Relig, top left, aged 17 in 1801, painted in Edinburgh by Henry Raeburn. Robert Holmes' portrait below it is also of William, but 4 years later and painted in Calcutta, when William had just passed out of Fort William College, top of his class, in Persian, Hindustani, and Bengali. Raeburn painted all 5 Fraser sons in Edinburgh, a journey of some 165 miles by horse or carriage from their home at Reelig. While in the city, the Fraser boys would surely have heard of the Edinburgh-born artist George Willison, who had died a rich man in Edinburgh a few years earlier in 1797. Willison had returned from India in 1781 after lucrative employment at the court of the Nawab of Arcot, and it was at that court where this portrait was painted by Willison in 1775. Edinburgh was home for many more Scots than I will mention here. One of the most famous or infamous of these India Scots wielded such power and patronage that he was nicknamed Harry IX, King of Scotland. Henry Dundas was Solicitor General for Scotland from 1766 to 1774 and monopolised the lucrative sale of East India Company appointments. His statue and soaring column were installed in St Andrew's Square, Edinburgh in 1821, and it might remind you of Ochterlony's Shahid Minar in Calcutta, which was erected just 7 years later in 1828. 200 years later, in 2020, Dundas's monument was an early target for anti-empire protests, but fortunately the retain and explain policy has prevailed and the statue still stands in Edinburgh. Facing the column is the home of a distant relative, Sir Lawrence Dundas. Called the Nabob of the North, he was actually never in India, but nevertheless made 3 fortunes: in banking, in supplying the armies of Europe during the 7 Years' War of 1756-63, and in income from the Forth and Clyde Canal, which linked Edinburgh with Glasgow. Lawrence Dundas's townhouse, which you see here, was commissioned from Sir William Chambers in 1772. Today, it is home and the flagship headquarters for the Royal Bank of Scotland, but not for much longer. Dundas's home will soon be on the market, another casualty of the economic and digital impact of COVID. Some of Edinburgh's institutions are no longer in their original homes. The first Botanic Garden of Edinburgh was in Leith Walk. Today's magnificent garden and world-famous collections are a mile further west. In George Square, an 18th century construction, home of many 18th and 19th century Scots returning from India, the original east and west sides of the square were demolished in the 1960s to make way for the university expansion in glass and concrete, and you can just see some of that visible in the background. However, the university Old Quad, designed by Robert Adam and William Henry Playfair in 1827, still stands, not far from the magnificent law library of the Writers to the Signet, as solicitors are known in Scotland. In India, the Scots would have been writers to the East India Company. In Scotland, their profession was a legal one. From their botanic garden and university studies, Edinburgh exported the botanists Cleghorn, Hooker, Buchanan, and Alexander Gibson, author of Bombay Flora in 1861 and the first conservator of forests to the Bombay government, and Robert White, who returned home from India on sick leave in 1831 with 100,000 specimens packed in 6 cases, weighing a total of 2 tons. Other Edinburgh graduates included Jonathan Duncan, for 16 years governor of Bombay and founder of the Sanskrit College at Benares, Colonel Alexander Gardner, subject to the recent book by John Kay, The Tartan Turban, John Forbes Royal, botanist and organizer of the Indian section of the 1851 exhibition, and William Erskine, a legal man who published the first scientific description of the Elephanta Caves in 1819 in the transactions of the Literary Society of Bombay. Mention also from Edinburgh the artist John Seaton, son of a gem engraver, and Hamilton's, the jewellers, who still had a branch in Simla until 1970. Scotland's largest city is Glasgow, famous for its shipyards on the River Clyde, for potteries, textile production, steelworks, and cast iron. I'm sure you'll remember that the pillars in the central hall of Mysore Palace, which you see bottom left, were made at Walter Macfarlane's foundry in Glasgow. With exports to every continent, Glasgow was known as the second city of empire after Calcutta. Glasgow was home, amongst others, to the canal engineer James Goodwin, the botanist Thomas Thompson, Sharp, Stewart and Co., who built the first locomotives for the Kalka-Simla Railway and for the Nilgiri and Darjeeling lines, Thomas Munro, soldier and administrator, the missionary Claudius Buchanan, the enterprising Thomas Lipton, who built and operated a fleet of fast sailing ships, the tea clippers, which captured the tea market, Lady Willison, born Anne Campbell Macleod, whose letters from India were published in 1911, and Dr. Alexander Kellis, whose climbs in the Sikkim Mountains in 1907 to 21 generated valuable reports about the human body's reactions to very high altitudes. The Scotland-India textile story would fill many lectures, visiting Paisley, Dundee, Kirkcaldy, Doonside, Patna, Galashiels and Howick. To represent all of these and a truly enlightened industrialist, I show top right New Lanark on the River Clyde, and once the largest cotton spinning complex in Britain. Its founder was actually a Welshman, Robert Owen, but it was here in Scotland that he not only built homes for his workforce, but also the world's first nursery school and a cooperative store. He established adult evening classes, a sick pay fund, and a social centre, the New Institute for Formation of Character. What a contrast in 1800 to the industrial slums of Glasgow, Paisley, and Dundee, whose occupants, if they had an annual holiday at all, would go downriver to the sea or perhaps inland to a loch, like Loch Katrine. By the mid-19th century, and of course encouraged by the enthusiasm of Queen Victoria for all things Scottish, the railways had opened up these highland landscapes to the tourist. But Scots in India were thinking of Loch Katrine a century earlier. Maria Graham, in her Journal of a Residence in India, published in 1812, wrote that Trincomalee in Ceylon reminded her of Loch Katrine, and she added that, except that the crags in Trincomalee had vari-coloured blossoms. Maria, aged 23, had accompanied her father, George Dundas, to India when he was appointed head of the naval works at the company's dockyard at Bombay in 1808. In 1809 in Bombay, Maria married the Scottish naval officer, Thomas Graham, whom she had fallen in love with on her passage to India. Dundee was famous for jam, jute, and journalism, home of Keeler's marmalade, jute mills, journalism, and Valentine's postcards. By 1854, the jute mill near Serampore was operating with machinery made in the Douglas foundry in Dundee, where the Camperdown Works was the largest jute mill in the world. And by 1908, 38 jute companies were operating in Calcutta. One of the few mills surviving in Dundee today, Verdant Works, is now a museum, and its archives include a fascinating photo album recording the graves of Scottish jute mill managers who had died in India. From Dundee, George Johnson travelled to India as a company surgeon and became secretary to Sir John Lindsay from nearby Balcarres, appointed to investigate relations between the company and the Nawab of Arcot in 1769. From Dundee in 1777, the 54-year-old artist, Catherine Reed, set off for Madras, returning after only 1 year in India. She was devoted to her niece, Helena Beatson, who accompanied Catherine to India and who married there Charles Oakley, governor of Madras. Helena's youthful portrait by her aunt, Catherine Reed, dates from 1767. It was a Japanese architect, Kengo Kuma, who designed Dundee's most recent attraction, V&A Dundee. Inside, a long-term display illustrates the two-way exchange of pattern and design between India and Scotland. Moving away from Scotland's main cities, General Norman Macleod from the Isle of Skye fought in both the Second and the Third Mysore Wars, and Macleod's Highlanders fought as the 73rd and later the 71st Regiment of Foot. Macleod and his second wife were both painted by Zoffany in Calcutta in about 1787. The Clan Macleod chief returned home with enough money to modernise and extend his 15th century castle of Dunvegan, as you see it today. Very similar military portraits were visible in the well-known painting of David Ochterlony, watching a Nautch. Although David was born in Boston, the Ochterlony family were from the rolling farmlands of Angus, between Perth and Aberdeen. For most Scots in India, home was not a castle, but a farm, a cottage, cramped slums or tenements, though these tenements were very different from the civilised Parsi tenements, which are home to many in Bombay today. Closeburn in Dumfriesshire, southwest Scotland, is a fairly typical village, with its small kirk or church, a mill, and an old defensive tower house. One Dumfriesshire Scot was first Bishop of Madras, Daniel Corrie, well ahead of his time for refusing to allow any caste distinctions in his communion services. Closeburn was also home to the Kirkpatrick family, William, who was resident at Hyderabad, and James, his brother, the White Moguls of Dalrymple's book. Hyderabad, however, has its own extraordinary link with Scotland. The sixth Nizam, Mahbub Ali Khan, who ruled from 1869 to 1911, was famous for his elaborate wardrobe. The Nizam's passion for a particular Scottish tweed prompted him to buy one firm's entire output for 5 years. However, neither fashion nor passion last that long, and the Nizam soon found new interests, but an endless stream of parcels of made-up Scottish tweed continued to arrive at Hyderabad, never to be worn. Today, Harris tweed has been adapted by an enterprising young Scot, Catriona McIver, from the Isle of Lewis, as part of a programme to preserve and expand the skills of the traditional handweavers of Chenimalai, the handloom town in Tamil Nadu. James Todd will be familiar as a military surveyor, British agent in Kota and Udaipur, and author of Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, published in 1826 and 1832. He's shown here with his Jain Guru in a painting by Ghazni. Todd was born in London, but his family came from Bowness, a coal mining town and port on the south bank of the River Forth. By the 1890s, industrialisation and the railway had brought prosperity to Bowness, and land was acquired for a town hall and park. In 1902, the City Council approved the plans for this town hall from the Edinburgh firm of Peddy and Brown, where a young George Wittet was employed as an assistant. So Wittet would have worked on the proposals for this Bowness town hall before he left for India in 1904. A home designed in 1824 in the Gothic revival style is Blair Juan, home of Thomas and Eliza Hunter Blair in Ayrshire. Thomas Hunter Blair went to India as military secretary to Sir Charles Colville, military commander at Bombay, and he married Eliza Norris at St Thomas's Cathedral, Bombay, in June 1820. During the 8 years that she was in India, Eliza made very competent drawings of many places, including Chandrawati and Mount Abu, both of which were engraved to illustrate James Todd's second book, travels in Western India. Scotland has a long and strong tradition in education. St Andrews University was founded 600 years ago in 1413. Its graduates included Dr Anne Buddle, clergyman and teacher, who introduced what became known as the Madras system. Lacking sufficient teachers, Bell devised the system of older boys or monitors receiving lessons and then instructing younger pupils, many of whom were the sons of soldiers. Another St Andrews graduate was John Willison, seen here in a photograph by Hill and Adamson. A very visible link between India and St Andrews today is Madras, as the school is known, opened originally in 1833 and named after Bell's teaching system. The name is displayed in large standing capitals outside today's building. From Aberdeen came granite for some of the pillars of Victoria Terminus, with you in Bombay, and graduates from Aberdeen University included John Forbes Watson, author of the famous Textile Manufacturers of India, Thomas Sutherland, chairman of the P&O Shipping Company, and the photographer Colin Murray. Nathaniel Woolwich was born in Denmark, but he graduated from Aberdeen University and became superintendent of the Botanic Garden in Calcutta. The family of James Skinner of Skinner's Horse Frame came from Montrose, 40 miles south of Aberdeen down the coast, and another branch of the Skinner family established the firm of Skinner and Company in Bombay. Reverend James Shepherd, doctor and missionary, was born in 1847 at Bonaccord Terrace, Aberdeen, and died there in 1926, after working 48 years in Udaipur. He built the Rajputana Mission Hospital, opened in 1886, and the church now named in his honour, which celebrated its 125th anniversary in Udaipur in 2016. Shepherd's biography, written by a fellow Scot and missionary, George Carstairs, begins with Shepherd's visit on furlough in 1912 to the island of Nos, far north in Shetland, home of Arthur Anderson, founder of the Peninsula and Orient shipping line, the P&O. To reach Nos, you take a ferry from Lerwick, Shetland's capital, to the next island, Bressa, walk 6 kilometres across it, and signal to Nos, seen here on the skyline. Nos is uninhabited, but the conservation ranger will bring a small dinghy over to collect you. Shepherd walked across the island to the eastern headland of Nos, about 60 metres high, when he visited in 1912. He then walked back to the shepherd's cottage. When he offered to pay for the cup of tea which the shepherd's wife had provided, she preferred to sell him a ticket for a charity she supported, the leper hospital in Udaipur. Imagine Shepherd's amazement to come home, all the way home from Udaipur, and find that a shepherd's wife back home in Shetland was supporting the hospital that he worked in Udaipur. All these islands have their own equally memorable stories and traditions and landscapes, from Nos to Mull in the west, home of Lachlan Macquarie, which you see Tobermory on the Isle of Mull photograph, and the Outer Hebrides with the white sands of Lewis and Harris, which we've seen as the home of Colin Mackenzie. Looking at these landscapes, one can understand why the Scots have always identified so closely with the land they call home, and why each Scottish regiment recruited locally became such a tightly knit band. For the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the 91st and the 93rd, Sutherland was bleak but majestic. It was home. Argyllshire is much closer to the modern regimental HQ at Stirling, where the Bannockburn Monument celebrates the defeat of the English and Edward II by Robert the Bruce in 1314. This area was home to Mount Stuart Elphinstone, Robert Abercrombie, and at nearby Corus, Colonel James Stewart, who commanded the Bombay army during the Mysore Wars. For the Seaforths, the 78th and the 72nd, their home base was Fort George outside Inverness. built after the Jacobite Rising of 1745 and large enough to garrison 2,000 soldiers. A building on this scale, with the latest angle bastion design, took 21 years to build at the huge cost of £200,000, about 20 million in today's money. For the Gordon Highlanders, 92nd and 75th, Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire is home. And for both these regiments, thoughts of home would certainly have included the Highland landscape. Glenshee in Perthshire is not as dramatic as the Highland landscapes further north, but I've included the image because this area of the Highlands would certainly have been known to George Wittet. For the Highland Light Infantry, the 71st and the 73rd, their home base is Glasgow. And I show also two of the Oriental transfer printed ceramics, which were produced in Glasgow for the Eastern Market by J and M.P. Bell, one of 8 Glasgow potteries. You will see that there were different designs. They were available in 8 colours and 29 Oriental designs, evoking China as well as India. Bell also introduced local scripts, Malay, Chinese, Burmese, as part of his trademark. And finally, the 42nd, the Black Watch, raised in 1715, wearing the blue, green, black government tartan, and with Perth as their regimental home base today. Government defence cuts in 1967, 1994 and 2006 resulted in the loss of all these regimental identities and local loyalties, now all merged into one, the Royal Regiment of Scotland. Uniquely in the British Army, however, the former regimental dress has been retained for each battalion's pipes and drums, and for the hackles or small coloured plumes in their bonnets. A chapter of Scotland's military history may end here, but another chapter begins for CSMVS and its anniversary year, because Perth is where George Wittet's birth is officially recorded, although some sources give Blair Athol 25 miles further north. After qualifying as an architect, Wittet worked in Edinburgh from 1898 to 1902 in the busy practice of Peddy and Brown, and surviving records show how very busy a company they were. Lockdown has prevented visits to libraries and archives and travel across Scotland, and more research is planned on Wittet's work in Scotland pre-India. Meanwhile, here is a small selection of the houses, the homes, which Peddy and Brown worked on during the years when Wittet was employed by them. The 3 houses all date from 1902, North Berwick, Haddington and Lockerbie. Drumshoek Gardens and Murray Place are in Edinburgh, and it was here that the firm made alterations. And you also see the organ case and pulpit, which they designed and made for the Church of Scotland in Palmerston Place. Even from this small selection, you can see the variety of styles and settings which defined home in Scotland. So when he was busy working on the Gateway of India, or CSMVS, did Wittet sometimes think back to Scotland, to these houses and homes which he had worked on, and to his own home in Perth, under a distant sky? As you know, he died under the Bombay sky in 1926. He was only 44. Next year sees the 100th anniversary of the opening of Wittet's museum building on the 11th of January 1922. We look forward very much to the launch of CSMVS's centenary programme and to celebrating Wittet's achievements in 2022. Thank you very much.